Hi, this is Brendan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm doing another Q&A today. I apologize for the long delay in doing these. I was revising the Strange Tales of New England book for edits, so I finally sent that to the editor, and so I'm back kind of focused on this stuff. Again, this is a Q&A for Wandering Heroes of Ogre. For those who don't know what that is, it's a Wuxia RPG. It's the sort of the ancestor of Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades. And so I got a number of questions. The first thing I want to say, though, before I do some more clarifications, because I've been answering a lot of them now, and one thing that I should say is I'm always a little bit reluctant to clarify anything because I always like to allow the GM to interpret the rules. So most of the clarifications that I've been trying to do are around like actual errors in the text or things that just really weren't clarified that needed to be. But most of the time, I would say my advice to the GM is to try to understand what you think the spirit of the rule is and apply that going forward. Because I find the more I clarify things, the more I kind of legalize the system. It's sort of like I'm creating a codification of the legal points of the system, and then it just gets more complicated. So do take my clarifications with a grain of salt. These are sort of just somebody has asked me a question, I'm responding. These are not like etched in stone by any stretch. I can be incorrect in my assessment of a rule, even though this is a game I designed. I designed it with two other people, and I've evolved my play style over time since it's come out. So a lot of these rules I apply differently now. And sometimes when I'm answering a question, I'm trying to go back and think about how I was managing this rule when the game was first written. I would say the first 2 years, 3 years of play of this game is that's what's reflected in the rule book. And this game is 10 years old, so I play it very differently now. So the first question, and most of these come from one poster over at the RPG Pub. I simplified a lot of the questions because there were a lot of follow-up points and they got very detailed, and so I'm just trying to give broad responses. If anybody's curious about a more detailed response to them, they can go to the RPG Pub Wandering Heroes of Ogre thread and check it out. But the poster wanted to know if there's an errata available. And there isn't an errata, there is a revised XP sheet. I have a master list of errata that I've been compiling. I should probably put it out sometime soon. I haven't been asked the question enough to think that it's a pressing matter, but I do have an ongoing list of errata, and I'm going to be adding to it because I'm planning on reading through the book again for a campaign I'm doing right now, and I'm going to be taking a black pen and making notes about errors I find, things like that. There are plenty of typos and things like that. One day I would love to go through and do a revised edition. I don't know if I'm ever going to have the resources to do that. That's really what it boils down to. If I do, then I might issue a revised edition. If I did that, though, it wouldn't be an updated rulebook based on how I play the game, because I wouldn't want to, even though I play the game differently now, I wouldn't want to alter the system for people who are accustomed to the rules as written. So I wouldn't. I get irritated when companies do that, so I wouldn't want to do that to people that have been playing this for ages. But as I get into this, I will talk about some of the mechanics that I personally don't use anymore, which I think I've addressed in other podcasts, but I'm happy to address it again here. So the poster wants to know if they can use light melee on stick reclining stance. Now, this is a typo in the game, so I don't have the rule in front of me, so I'm just going to go by memory. But basically, stick reclining stance is a stance. It's a kung fu technique, and it lists off heavy melee and medium melee, but it doesn't list off light melee, which is what a stick is. And so that's an obvious typo. Whenever you see an obvious typo like that, just assume it's a typo, because clearly light melee is what's called for there. You can use it for other things like spears and stuff like that, so that's why heavy melee is in there. I don't know what caused that typo. What I would imagine is it was one of two things. Either it was just clipped off, but I don't think so, because I think there's an or in there between the two options. I think what's more likely is a stick may have initially been a medium melee weapon, and that's why it's not listed. It's not listing light in there, but I don't know the specific reason. But it is a typo, so ignore it. Allow my light melee, and going forward, if you see anything like that where it's like, oh, that clearly looks wrong, assume it's wrong. Again, there are typos like that in the book periodically, so I'm going to try to gather them up, and I'll hopefully be able to post the errata at some point. Though I have an idea for doing a much more elaborate errata, so it might take a little bit longer than putting it out next month. So this is an interesting question. How does the aiming strike work? And then they go on to say, it says that you can aim, if you aim without interruption for a round, you get a plus 1d10 bonus on your attack the next round. And so they want to know what counts as interruption. Is it a foe's attack and damage? Is it distancing the foe? And they sort of feel it might be odd if the person is just moving back every time they're trying to aim. And so my answer to that is it's up to the GM. The GM ultimately has say over what constitutes an interruption. And the reason it's up to the GM is I think this kind of thing always really boils down to the specifics. And I feel like when games hash those things out in too much detail, you get something that works in like 8 of the cases, but out of 10, but there's 2 where it doesn't. And so that's what I'm always worried about with hashing that kind of thing out in too much detail. That said, I personally wouldn't worry about distancing. I feel like distancing is something that's already kind of handled by the movement of the individual characters. It's kind of a judgment call whether distancing would be a factor in interrupting an aim strike. And, again, aim strike isn't something that I'm super enamored with anyways, so I feel like, I don't know, I just don't, I think it's a fairly minor bonus. It's not something that you really want to torture yourself over. If it seems reasonable, the person should get the aim strike, allow them to. Now I should say here, I kind of answered incorrectly when I addressed this in the thread. If I get a chance, I'll respond. I'll go in and edit. I won't change what I said, but I might add a note. But if I forget to do that, just note, here, in my response, I sort of merged prepared and aim strike together in an explanation. And so here I want to clarify there are 3 basic ways that you can kind of like go for more accuracy or more focus in your attacks. There's the prepared strike, and the prepared strike is really more about kind of like when somebody's coming around the corner and you get yourself ready to strike them when they come into view. So that's more about getting a surprise on a person. You kind of initiate a sort of surprise situation for them with it. It's not the same as a targeted strike or an aim strike. Targeted strike is kind of like the classic, I want to hit the zombie in the head. And so that really is more about taking a penalty in order to, on the attack roll, in order to either boost the damage roll or to get some special effect, like trying to get a zombie in the head or get a vampire in the heart. And then there's the aim strike. And so that's what we were talking about before. So those are the 3 different approaches. I find players don't use these quite as much as they get more kung fu techniques, but they're still, I think, an important part of the game. And so, that's my answer to that question. I'll maybe have if I remember, I'll try to do a more thorough podcast on special actions and conditions in combat in general. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting question. So then the other question the person asked, this was related to the initial question they asked, was, is the stick reclining stance overpowered? And I responded with my thoughts on it. I think the poster feels that the technique is overpowered, and so I don't think that my points they found terribly persuasive. It's a subjective judgment call, so if you find a technique overpowered or underpowered, that's that's really up to you what you think. I don't want to tell people that they're wrong. If I think something's overpowered and they think it's underpowered, or vice versa, or if they think it's broken and I don't think it's broken, that's based on their own subjective sense of whether something busts the game, but also on their own experience in the campaign. Like maybe they're dealing with things that I don't normally deal with in my campaigns, that or their players have a different approach. So personally, I don't think it's overpowered. I can see why people would find it overpowered, and I'll try to find the technique if I can while I'm talking. But I think that it's one of these techniques where it reads like it's overpowered, but then the more you play the game, the more you realize the issue that it creates is not one that really matters as much over the course of a campaign. So I'll read the entry here. So reclining stick stance. It's Chi 1, which is an important factor because that means you can get it right out of the gate. You lean back casually, balancing your body horizontally with a spear or stick, making you difficult to strike. From this position, you can move and evade strikes effortlessly. This lowers your initiative result by 3 for any attack, but improves your parry against melee weapons by 2. That's significant because parry is how you protect yourself from melee attacks. 2 is a pretty good boost. So the concern here is that if you do this in conjunction with some other things, you could get to a parry 10, say. This imposes a minus. So on the cathartic effect is it imposes a minus 1d10 penalty to anyone trying to strike you with a melee weapon. So on top of the bonus, you're also imposing a minus 1d10. Now, what that this formula doesn't always work, but basically 2 points on a defense are roughly equal to a minus 1 or minus 2 on the attack roll. So that's effectively almost the same as giving you another 2 points, which we couldn't do because that would have sort of, because so many people would already be at 10, it wouldn't really be an additional advantage in a lot of cases. So that's why we went with the penalty on the attacker. I mean, that's a pretty good technique. It definitely is useful. But I've just seen so many players who take it and it doesn't end up being a big deal in the campaign. And I have a lot of... I intentionally game with players who optimize and kind of encourage them to optimize so I can find the things in the system that are more powerful than other things. And this is a technique that hasn't been as appealing to them for a variety of reasons. I think because there are other ways to get your parry up to a 10. There are better things to invest your kung fu techniques in. I'm not saying it's not good. It is a good technique, but I haven't seen it used that much to exploit the game. That said, if it is presenting an issue in your campaign, I mean, a player having a good parry is not a super big deal in the game. If they're hard to hit, that's okay. It might be more of an issue if you have like 6 players all doing it, and it's constantly creating a situation where opponents aren't able to, where it's bogging down combat because the opponents are missing so much. If you're finding that's the case, there's 2 options I would present to you. One is simply change the technique. The GM is entirely within their right to say this technique's too overpowered. I don't like what Brendan Davis and company did, so I'm going to change it. That's one of the reasons why I made the Kung Fu technique section public domain. Now, I'll get into the public domain issue in a moment, but the other option is the one that I always go to with people, and that's evolution of the martial world. I have a character who just recently acquired a really powerful counter in the game. I know it's a powerful counter. It was originally put into the game as the evolution of the martial world to sort of deal with a powerful technique. So, the response to that in the setting is naturalistic, where, and this is something you see in the genre, where somebody gets a really great kung fu technique, so now somebody who's been defeated by it or has witnessed it tries to come up with a workaround. It's sort of like the classic Masters of the Flying Guillotine situation, or Snake in the Eagle's Shadow, or Lady Hermit, where the part of the fun is going into the wilderness and figuring out how to deal with this problem. So if your players are using this reclining stick stance in a way that you find objectionable or that you feel is just making the game unbalanced enough for you, then come up with an NPC who's been observing this and has a way to work around it. Maybe he makes it ineffective or even turns it into a liability where, you literally can have a technique where that targets technique. So you could have something where this technique, when used against somebody who is used in reclining stick stance, does additional damage or nullifies their defense. Whatever it is, the sky's the limit. You can come up with it. This is a sort of this is meant to be a creative martial world filled with martial arts that are dynamic and reacting to one another. So again, that would be my suggestion there. And also the evolution of the martial world, that is the way that this game operates. So these techniques are not designed with power balance in mind. So even though my response to the reclining stick stance was, well, I don't think that that's particularly overpowered. That doesn't mean there aren't overpowered techniques in the game. There are. That's just one that I don't personally find overpowered. I can point you guys to Blade of the Dancing Fox, which is the most. It might not be the most overpowered technique in the game, but it is certainly up there. And it's one that everybody in my campaign knows about. Now, I've developed responses to Blade of the Dancing Fox, but it's still a very good technique. But I don't find that to be a problem because this is a genre where you have characters who are really good at what they do, who have incredible martial arts and can, and so it's just not something that I see as a bug in the game. We intentionally made it to have, in game terms, broken techniques. But if you don't like that, if you want a more balanced system, you can change them. And one of the reasons why I made the Kung Fu chapter, which is chapter 3 in Wandering Heroes of Wargate, in public domain, and again, nobody's really taken me up on this, so maybe I was like overly optimistic about how people would engage this public domain feature. But the idea was, I figured, well, that means people can take the actual text and they can republish the text. It's not a problem, it's public domain. And so they can tweak the text as well. So you could literally copy and paste all of the techniques from chapter 3. You could revise them to take out all the stuff you don't like. So if your issue with techniques is they're overpowered in some cases and you want to balance them out, you could go through, you could leave all of the other techniques intact, but take just the ones you find imbalanced and bring them down to sort of a more balanced level. And you could package that, publish that. It's totally fine. Again, this one chapter in the book is in the public domain, and it's for that reason. It was so that people could do that, so that they could post the techniques onto forums without worrying about, are we posting too much text from the rule book. I thought that people being able to engage with the techniques in that way and alter them would be useful. So again, you don't necessarily have to go through the whole chapter and do that, but you can individually adjust the techniques to your taste. I don't for a minute believe that everything I wanted in a wuxia game is what everybody else wanted. When I made Wandering Heroes of Wargate, the reason I made it the way I did is because I had been looking for my perfect wuxia game, and I would always find games that were like 60-70% what I wanted, but there'd be this 30 or 40% that I didn't like about them, and I started kind of combining them. So I would be using this rule system combined with this rule system. I would just kind of create these Frankenstein monsters, and then when we were working on Sartorius, I realized that would be actually a really good structure to do for a wuxia thing. So that's where these started. But one downside of that is that it wasn't planned in the way that the other books were planned. So I think that some of the warts and boils are occasionally visible. But yeah, I think that if you want to change the technique, go ahead. If you feel it's overpowered, that's fine. Change it. I encourage people to make changes to the system. There are even things, honestly, when I go through the book and I look at them, there were just decisions made when we were designing it where I look at a technique and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't do it that way now. That's way over engineered, or that doesn't make sense, or I don't like that it does that, or that's not clear. So, absolutely make adjustments that you want. I think that's fine. And I think the techniques that are in the book, they're just kind of a starting point. The idea is the GM and the players are creating more techniques as they go. That's what will really make the game interesting. They suddenly meet a master who has techniques they've never seen before. That's sort of how that's how I run the game. And I don't worry too much about balance. I'm not at all worried about that. I'm worried about flavor. When you do design a technique, I can give a few pieces of advice, even if you're just revising one. One, always start with the flavor. Don't start with the mechanic. It's easy to think, oh, I'm going to do one that's based around affecting defenses. And don't trick yourself. Don't think that's what you're going to do and then think you can start with flavor. Start with the flavor and then try to figure out the mechanics. But when you do develop the mechanics, keep them focused and simple. So try not to have a technique that's got like 8 ideas in it. The worst techniques in this book have like 8 ideas in them, consistently. Try to have a technique that's got 1 or 2 ideas, and it really should be very focused. This technique does this. You have this little flavor text that tells you the technique stabs people through the heart, and if there's an opponent behind them, it can keep going and stab more, whatever the technique is. Then you say, make a blank skill roll against blank, on a success blank, on a total success blank, on a failure blank, and then you have the cathartic effect. Sometimes you'll have to add additional, qualifiers and things in there. But the best techniques follow that very tight structure. So also on stances in general, I've fallen a lot less in love with stances over time. I still do use them, but I'm not as big on them in the game. I liked them at the time because I liked the idea of what they represented. I like what stances are. Maybe one day I'll put together a new book of stances where I kind of go through and I have like a more robust list, because I think one of the things, I'm not sure if it's that I don't like the stances so much or if we just don't have enough. Though there are new stances in the other books. So, and also I have a couple more questions here, so I'll address these. What happens when a character is stunned? So all that happens is you can't attack or move. That's what happens when you're stunned. And it usually will say for whatever period of time. However, it's kind of a little bit in the GM's judgment to decide what that really means. Like if a GM wanted to say, well, you can move, but you can't attack, I don't really object to that. But yeah, it's just that you when you're stunned, you can't move or attack. So that's the Q&A for today. I'm trying to think. I'm going to be working on some more Immortal Insights, maybe posting them on the blog. In my current campaign, the players have got to very high level, and so I want to I want to start developing more insights for different pathways to immortality, and I'm not 100% sure how feasible it is to do like 3 or 4 tables, but if it is feasible, I'll end up posting them somewhere in some form. So anyways, I will let you go, and until later, I'll talk to you next time.